Hello and greetings to everyone. Hello to the followers of the Fundación Alternativas and to Casa Árabe's followers as well on different shores and different time zones. It is really a pleasure and a privilege to have gathered a stellar cast of analysts for this webinar. The Gulf and the Magreb in uncertain times, global players, reshaped regions, and transnational trends. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, ahlan wa sahlan. If one follows current affairs in the southern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula, it is clear that new power struggles are playing out in the region. These are not only military and economic, but also ideological forces are fighting for influence. Soft power is exercised in mysterious ways, and there is no such thing as a by-the-book concept or logic anymore when we see all the alliances melt and transform in record time. Therefore, the certainties of the past are gone, and the power vacuums created by the EU's lack of action on one side and the US disengagement on the other, also heightened by the new priorities brought by the COVID-19 pandemic in the past year, have given way to greater involvement of other actors. We think of Russia and Turkey across the region, but also of Gulf countries in the Maghreb. A realignment has been taking place with surprisingly assertive foreign policies coming from Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, adding more spice to Moscow and Ankara's concoctions. To pick up just two obvious cases, how has the conflict in Libya been shaped by these dynamics? And on the other hand, what kind of normalization with Israel is unfolding? What is the tip of the iceberg telling us about the negotiations we don't see? And where is the balance of power tilting towards? We know the Gulf and Maghreb states share interests and concerns. They certainly share a history as well, but we are yet to see if they will tend to cooperation or confrontation. Movements throughout the Mediterranean space are fragmented and encompass events at many levels, sub-regional, regional, and transcontinental. These uncertain times bring about the need to discuss who are these players, state, non-state, individuals too, lest we forget, and what are they seeking to achieve? But mostly, how is this already affecting us on both sides of the Mediterranean and on the other side of the Atlantic as well? And this is why Casa Árabe and Fundación Alternativas have joined forces to gather a set of experts who will help us to untangle some of these complicated matters. We will have two sessions of 75 minutes with 3 panelists on each session and a discussant who will gather conclusions. Then we will have a third and last segment of closing remarks. My colleague Ichazo Dominguez de Azabal will moderate the second session, and I already thank her for having joined forces and led this initiative from Fundación Alternativas. Let me start by introducing the first session. Gulf-Maghreb relations, interconnectivities, divergences, and opportunities with its participants, Fatiha Dazieni, Cinzia Bianco, Frederick Wary, and Irene Fernandez Molina, who will give us the conclusion. First, by order of appearance, is Fatiha. Fatiha Dazieni is a researcher on Arabian Peninsula and Gulf and Middle East affairs at IRSEM, the Institute for Strategic Research at the École Militaire in Paris. She is a lecturer at Sciences Po Lille, where she teaches history and socio-political developments in the Arabian Peninsula. She has a PhD from the Institute for Political Studies in Paris. Her main line of research revolves around the monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as regional and security issues between GCC states and the Persian Gulf states. So welcome to the three of you, and Fatiha will give us a historical overview of this gradual Gulf penetration in the Maghreb, or something on those terms. Please, Fatiha.
Thank you, Karim. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me for this panel. So I will refer in my first point to the two main recent phases of influence between the Arab Gulf monarchies and North African states. And second, I shall focus my talk on relation with Algeria and Morocco, with mentioning few words on Tunisia and Libya, and leaving aside Mauritania. So a short overview of Gulf-Maghrebi relations. Generally speaking, we attend the two main phases of politics of influence from rich Arab Gulf states in North African states in the recent years. The first was during mid-90s to 2000s, even though Saudi religious soft power expanded since the 80s, but mid-90s and 2000 coincided with the economic liberalization encouraged by the IMF and the World Bank in the Arab world, and Gulf investments from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and UAE began to flow in real estate, infrastructure, and services like tourism, communication, and finance in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt mainly, excluding Algeria due to the Black Decade of the 90s. This was according to a self-interest strategy without any malicious rivalry among GCC states at that moment. The second phase occurred during the Arab Spring decade of 2010, according to a mixed dynamic made of ideological stances and intrusive sentiments, according to polarized and divergent politics of influence from Qatar and UAE mainly, associated with the Saudi ally that displayed mainly in Libya and in Tunisia, but differently. During this phase, these Gulf states tried to use their interstates rift when the crisis has blown on June 2017 between the Arab Quartet, composed of KSA, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, versus Qatar. And for Gulf leaders, it was a maneuver to test their Maghrebi counterparts' loyalty. But this has not gone as in the Horn of Africa states, where the crisis affected very seriously Eastern Africa. On the reverse, the three core Maghrebi states stood a common position in adopting a non-concerted positive neutrality, all refusing to choose among their Gulf states counterparts. Now, my second point will focus on Algeria and Morocco relations with the Arab Gulf region. So referring to Algeria, this country and Arab Gulf monarchies never fully trusted themselves due to different geopolitical sensitiveness. In addition, Saudi Arabia's obvious financial support to the Algerian Salafi movement, Front Islamique du Salut, during the Black Decade, and the Gulf and the full support of GCC monarchies to Morocco on the Western Sahara issue were deterrent to good relations. But as I developed in Yahya Zubir's edited book last year dedicated to Algeria's domestic and foreign policies, relation with Saudi Arabia never reached the breakpoint, contrary to that with Iran, that openly gave its political support to the FIS, even pushing for the establishment of an Islamic republic in Algeria. So Algiers decided to sever its diplomatic relations with Tehran during more than 8 years, which was never the case with Riyadh. Then came the Bouteflika's effect in Algeria after he spent 15 years in Traversée du Désert as a close consultant to Sheikh Zayed, where he was able to capitalize substantial networks of ties with Gulf monarchs and business tycoons. This came to be very useful for Algeria to maintain a balanced relationship during the Arab Spring decade, where Algiers shared many similar views with Iran on MENA issues, such as their rejection in listing Hezbollah as a terrorist organization that Algiers considers as the resistance axis against Israel, contrary to Gulf states. But it's mainly on Libya's Gulfian interventionist policies, as well as in Tunisia's domestic meddling from Qatar with the Nahda party and the personal proximity with Rashid Ghannouchi, and then from UAE, that has not hesitated to suspend a tripartite security cooperation comprising France, Tunisia, and UAE in training, security, and anti-terrorist forces in Tunisia, putting into the balance the necessity for Al-Nahda party to withdraw from the Troika Tunisian transitionary government. And this was, of course, not acceptable for the Tunisian sovereignty. And this contributed also to infuriate the Algerian government against UAE meddling in Tunisian affairs. So Bouteflika's aftermath, even though General Gaid Saleh shared good personal relationship with Mohammed bin Zayed, the strongman in UAE, and personal financial interests in Dubai, but without sharing the obsessional ideological anti-Islamist vision of MBZ. Today, institutional relations between Algeria and Gulf states respect courtesy, but are politically very poor in the sense that either President Tebboune or General Said Shangreha, Algerian Army's chief of staff, do not see any problem in integrating Islamist parties to their governance, since they were already co-opted under Bouteflika's two last mandates. As for Morocco, we all know it's by far the Maghrebi state that enjoys the closest relation with Arab Gulf monarchies. This relation reached its apex during King Hassan al-Thani and King Fahd moment during the 80s. The two kings share brotherly relation that shifted into a family one through several weddings between these two royal families. As soon as Arab Spring provoked panic among Gulf royals, and especially in Saudi Arabia and UAE, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia proposed on May 2011 to Morocco and Jordan to join the GCC pact as a symbolic response to consolidate the Arab monarchical solidarity, to demonstrate Arab monarchical resiliency versus the failed Arab republics that have seen 4 statesmen defeated and replaced. However, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, for different national, political, and economic interests, firmly opposed that Saudi and Emirati initiative, accepting just their invitation in some fields of GCC cooperation, but refusing to integrate them as full members in their integrated market. Under Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, proximity relations with Morocco changed radically, with the new generation of Al Saud princes not familiar and not used to travel to Morocco or connecting with the Moroccan elite. Added to that, the new governmental ticket, M6, and the Islamist Ben Kiran government and the Gulf crisis cooled relation between Rabat, Riyadh, and also with UAE. But the UAE, and in particular Abu Dhabi, with his strongman MBZ, since he took control of the federal state destiny early 2014, was keen to establish a strong personal relationship with King Mohammed VI. This relationship is more or less replacing the special relationships King Fahd and King Hassan al-Thani shared. MBZ and M6 share the same business vision and ambitions for their countries and same aptitude to public diplomacy vis-à-vis the West. This relation is institutionally threatened by a strong security partnership. Significant numbers of Moroccans are members of the UAE police forces. Moreover, more than 500,000 Moroccan expatriates live in UAE, Qatar, and in a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia. Although their relation also knew turbulence with the refusal of Morocco to break with Qatar, thus Rabat decided on a false pretext to sever its relation with Iran, with which it had limited interest, and accusing the Iranian embassy in Algiers of supporting and training the Polisario in order not to anger too much its Gulf allies embarked in a cold war with Iran. Both Saudi Arabia and UAE were annoyed by King Hamz's cooperation with an Islamist party. So they supported the North American candidacy against Moroccan's candidacy to host the Football World Cup in 2026. This infuriated M6, who responded through Al Jazeera channel in announcing late January 2019 his withdrawal from the Arab-led coalition in Yemen, thus provoking Casa and UAE reaction in broadcasting a report denouncing the Moroccan propagandist narrative on Western Sahara. In parallel, Qatar is the other third main Gulf monarchy to invest in the Moroccan economy and share a common vision of geopolitics, especially on the issue of political Islam. The two monarchies share cordial relations that date back to 2013, coinciding with Sheikh Tamim's access to the throne, and a new Islamist Moroccan government led by Prime Minister Ben Khelaf from the Islamist Justice and Development Party. Emir Tamim supported Moroccan candidacy to World Cup 2026, contrary to Casa and UAE. This proximity explains the Moroccan positive neutrality during the Gulf crisis, knowing that the three Gulf states are among the top investors in Morocco. So I shall conclude mentioning two main points for the Q&A. First, Arab Spring moment hugely participated in exacerbating geopolitical divergence more than ever between the two regions, Magreb and the Arab Gulf states, dominated by the UAE-Saudi hardline axis, because they have radical different understanding on political Islam that is already integrated in Maghrebi states and not in Saudi Arabia and UAE, that have the same hostile position of political Islam than the Algerian militaries during the Black Decade. Added to that, today geopolitical interests that ties Morocco with its Gulf allies is reinvigorated by the newly Abraham Accord that did not by itself annoyed as much Algeria, because the cooperation between Morocco and Israel dates back King Hassan al-Thani, but in contributing to aggravate and revive the Western Sahara issue, which has been in the balance for Morocco's normalization with Israel. This could revive a conflict between Rabat and Algiers, and this situation could also create a potential for a new Daesh in Western Sahara and in aggravating the sub-Saharan terrorist problematic. This situation could be very damaging for EU and especially France at the front stage, because France shares the deepest relation with Morocco and faces, since the Arab Spring decade, a fierce competition of its interest in Algeria, in Tunisia, and Libya, with Turkey that gained tremendous political, industrial, and economic influence in that countries, but also with China and Russia, with very significant position. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fatiha, for this first introduction into what is actually a very complicated and I'd say multi-layered relations between these two blocks or these two regions. You have definitely pointed at those mysterious ways of soft power that I was mentioning, that can be date back to, as you were saying, the 1970s with Saudi and their very blunt religious, let's say, influence or interventions, but very recently also to that episode of with Al Jazeera, and how that broadcast, the type of broadcast, can also be exerting soft powers and deliver messages. I guess it's very, very tough to, in 10 minutes, manage to get the most out of these maps that are evolving, also highlighting the importance of individuals such as the both MBs, the Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ. These are obviously could take in themselves just that relationship and those dynamics a whole session. But let us move forwards, and we will have time to ask questions after the first three speakers deliver their first speech. So we move to Cinzia Bianco is a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She's based in Berlin, where she's working on political security and economic developments in the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf region and relations with Europe. Additionally, she's a senior analyst at Gulf State Analytics, and previously Cinzia was a research fellow for the European Commission's project on EU-GCC relations, Sharaka, between 2013 and 2014. She holds a master's degree in the Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London and a PhD in Middle East politics from the University of Exeter. So we often separate geopolitical and geoeconomic elements when we analyze the region's dynamics, whereas Cinzia, your scope finds interconnections. Please enlighten us. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and Fatiha for the great introduction. You gave us the historical context, sketched the major political dynamics and the ideological battles that are taking place in the Maghreb emanating from the Gulf. And I know that Fred has a fantastic expertise on security matters. Therefore, I thought there was a good intersection for me to cover, which is the geopolitics of infrastructures. And they are as much about security and politics in a way, as much about economic interests, of course, because, and now we will see during the short presentation, those infrastructures often overlap with political relations and are guided by security concerns. So let's go back to the starting point. While we believe that events such as a pandemic can turn back the clock on globalization, the fact of the matter is that actually globalization is accelerating, and quite prominently so, pushed at very high level from political considerations, from economic considerations, and so on and so forth, and emanating from geopolitical dynamics. So for instance, the rise of China and the fact that trade flows and flows of all kinds between China and Europe are constantly growing has given a new centrality to the Mediterranean. And this new centrality, especially in projection of the Mediterranean, has then naturally led the wealthy Gulf countries to explore opportunities to really turn the Arabian Peninsula into a pit stop, a crossroads between Asia and Europe via the Horn of Africa / Red Sea and North Africa / the Mediterranean. So we're seeing a number of projects emerging at the same time. The three main corridors that are emerging in terms of connectivity between the Maghreb and Europe are the so-called Western Corridor that goes from Morocco to Spain and then towards Northern Europe and even the United Kingdom. The Eastern Corridor, that it's just in its infancy, so really it's just about still making plans for it, that goes from Egypt to the Eastern Mediterranean, and then a so-called Central Corridor that links either Tunisia or Algeria to either Italy or Spain. or France, sorry. Why do I say either or? Because the central corridor is in fact the one most challenged by, for instance, security matters such as the war in Libya, because it was supposed to originally use Libya as a focal point, and by political developments such as the stagnation and the challenges that Tunisia is going through in the past 10 years. So let's delve a little bit deeper into these three options and see how the Gulf countries are in a way or another connected to these projects and interested or heavily involved. So let's start from the East. As we know, Egypt, after the coup d'etat that replaced the Muslim Brotherhood government with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has become incredibly close to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And so it's not a coincidence that at that point, those three powers increasingly started to also share, in a way, threat perceptions and, widely speaking, geopolitical alignments. One of the elements that is shared by these actors is a general hostility vis-a-vis Turkey. And coincidentally, also countries in the Eastern Mediterranean share the same hostility and growing concerns. I'm talking, of course, mostly about Greece and Cyprus, but there are also other countries in the Arab side of the Eastern Mediterranean have found a common cause with Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia in terms of concerns over Turkey. And so together, they have been increasingly coordinating on all different matters. We have seen joint military drills. We have seen political forums, such as the one organized by Greece under the name of Philia. But we have also seen increasingly the willingness to coordinate on joint infrastructural projects. There is, of course, first and foremost, the project about gas resources and the East Med pipeline that has been under discussion for a long time and currently is actually on hold due to concerns of high costs of the initial investment needed and the possibility of an uneconomical sort of result out of the investment. So, but alongside the energy investment, there are a number of other projects that basically are about interconnectivity and facilitating trade flows and the split of industrial supply chains across different countries in a way that pulls together resources and is hopefully mutually beneficial, but also then creates those avenues for to basically channel investments and trade flows from international powers such as Asian countries. On top of that, there are projects to invest in a new kind of infrastructure, which is the digital infrastructures, such as submarine cables that transmit data and are increasingly in demand as the circulation of data increases constantly. However, this is very much a development that is in progress and relies heavily on that sort of political coordination that we started talking about. This is quite different from the opposite side of the Magreb, which is the Western corridor that links Morocco to Spain and towards south with Senegal. So in that case, we have already a few interesting infrastructures in place. And let's start from the maritime infrastructures, for instance. The port of Dakar in Senegal is now directly connected to infrastructures on the coast of Morocco, for instance, and then north towards Spain. In all of these Southern African infrastructures, we have a heavy participation of the UAE in the financing and development of ports and maritime infrastructures. Both in Dakar and in the new development in Tangiers Med, there is a substantial contribution by the UAE in terms of investment, and there is an operating contract for DP World, the port operator from Dubai. in that equilibrium, there is also the interest and involvement of European countries, such as, for instance, France, but also Spain. And the fact that these infrastructures are increasingly connected means that also supply chains are becoming integrated slowly. On that front, there is, for instance, a French investment into a high-speed rail infrastructures that connects the Tangiers Med port in Morocco to other major economic power centers in the country, for instance, Casablanca. And finally, to the Central Corridor. In the Central Corridor, we see very clearly the competition that Fatiha already outlined. DP World, the Emirati port operator, is already present in Algiers and Janjan. But alongside those two developments, there is a growing role by together Turkey and Qatar to develop El Hamdaniya. That's directly rivaling the capacity of these two countries, of these two other infrastructures, because it has been developed as an international project that aims to turn the port in a deep sea port that has a far greater capacity that Algiers and Janjan can have. And so the fact that there are political controversies with the Algerian government certainly plays a role in the fact that there is a greater presence by the Turkish-Qatari sort of combined duo in the country and in the future of the country as it is planned than its opponents. As Fatiha said, there are common concerns, for instance, between Qatar and Turkey and Algeria on Libya, where they all oppose in a way or another, strongly or less strongly, General Khalifa Haftar. There is an alignment, for instance, and a dialogue going on between Algiers and Doha, although at times a bit confrontational, on gas, for instance, and the market and the evolution of the market and what that means in terms of future developments. Then, you know, directly in competition to Algeria, there is, of course, the so-called Tunisian option. And even there has been a lot of different options put on the table by the two sides. The Emiratis have tried to engage the Tunisian government, the Saudis have tried to engage them, and the Qataris have tried to engage them with the greater success. But so far, there seems to be sort of an overarching question that is blocking the further development of the Tunisian option, which is the lack of a proper opportunity to develop a deep sea port. There's only one project, which is in Enfida, which is still in its infancy and needs further development. But so therefore the Central Corridor is sort of where all of the different sides have in one way or another conflicting plans and are working to develop an alternative route. Where they do agree, however, is on the necessity to further invest into new submarine cables. We have mentioned how there is a similar project going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. What I didn't say earlier is that Egypt and the Suez Canal in particular are the single biggest point of failure globally for the digital infrastructures and in particular submarine cables, because basically over 70% of cables pass through the Suez Canal and therefore through the Red Sea. And this is a major point of vulnerability on one side, but it's also a major point of leverage for the Egyptian government. It's interesting to me, I think, especially if we try to look into a little bit towards projecting towards the future, that even the Egyptian allies, such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, all agree on the necessity to diversify from this overdependence on the Suez Canal for submarine cables and are eager to invest into new digital connectivity and connections between the Magreb and Europe, then potentially going further south towards Africa. And I will close here just to say that if we look at this issue of the geopolitics of infrastructure, particularly from a Gulf point of view, it's important, I think, to say that the Maghreb-Europe connection is only part of the story. In particular, if we look at an actor that has a more complex strategy, such as the UAE, the full story is to extend that connectivity towards the south, towards sub-Saharan Africa and towards the Horn of Africa. So this is suddenly important because it really puts in perspective the ambitions of these countries and sort of the very long-term perspective that we see from some of them. So for the UAE, developing maritime infrastructures in the Maghreb is as important as investing in the new rail connection between Egypt and Sudan, or new infrastructure connections between Senegal and Morocco. And then in the other maritime infrastructures in the Horn of Africa, where they have a direct influence already existing over most of the trade flowing. And I'll leave it there for questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, for helping us to widen even more this jigsaw. And you are totally right in telling us that it's not only about the Maghreb and the EU and the Gulf, but of what lies to the north and to the south, i.e. the Sahel or the EU and all those corridors, and who masters in the end these infrastructures. There is a lot of power behind that. Very interesting that you do point to this over dependence of the Suez Canal. I think not only for submarine cables, but we have seen with that huge boat stranded in the Suez Canal, what over dependence of the Suez Canal can do not only to the region but to the world. So we're going to move to Frederick Wary. He's a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He joins us from Washington. His research deals with armed conflict, security sectors, and identity politics, with a focus on Libya, North Africa, and the Gulf. Before joining Carnegie, Fred served as a 21-year-old veteran of the active and reserve components of the US Air Force, with tours across the Middle East and North Africa. He holds a doctorate in international relations from Oxford University and a master's in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. Thank you very much, Fred, for joining us. We know your focus on Libya sheds light on broader trends in the Maghreb Mediterranean basin and in the global order, especially the role of the United States and how its actions or inactions may impact or have impacted already Gulf actions in Libya. Very interesting also to be able to gauge this change we're witnessing now between the former Trump administration and the current Biden evolution. So the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for hosting this. Thanks to my co-panelists for really outstanding presentations, a tough act to follow. But I will be focusing on Libya as sort of a lens for viewing broader Gulf involvement in the Maghreb. And also I'll try to break up Gulf involvement in Libya into sort of phases to understand how we got to where we are and where we're going. Just by way of backdrop, I think Gulf involvement in the Maghreb, is really a function of some broader, global shifts toward multipolarity. And I think when we're looking at Libya, especially toward the sort of evisceration of multilateral norms on embargo enforcement, divisions within the UN Security Council, US disengagement. And I really want to emphasize, and this is partly from my perspective coming from Washington, that the US, signaling matters in terms of managing Gulf rivalries in Libya. And we've seen this retrenchment from the US in Libya over the years, disunity in the EU. All of this, I think, has conspired to really open the playing field for regional powers. We can call them middle powers, but obviously these sparring regional powers. My co-panelists, I think, really emphasized the multiple dimensions of Maghreb involvement to include infrastructure, the economy. I want to emphasize the ideational, division, the idea that ideas matter, that this is about political order, especially when we're looking at the role of the Emirates. So again, the Maghreb and Libya, it's a place of enormous opportunity, as we heard from Dr. Bianco, this gateway to investments in Africa, an economic prize, resource rich, but it's also a place of deep insecurity, right? It's up for grabs, it's unknown. And I think that's a huge magnet for why we're seeing certain types of behavior. And so I will focus on that ideational dimension and also the Islamist dimension. When we're talking about Libya, again, Gulf involvement obviously predates the 2011 revolution. You had Gulf energy interests in Libya. You had important personalities development. And I really want to underscore the importance of individuals in the Libyan context. Libya has no institutional framework, right? No institutions. And that means brokers, intermediaries, individuals, personalities are so important for Gulf influence, channeling Gulf influence. And sometimes these are Libyan personalities that reside in the Gulf. And I think this is an important concept, that they act as intermediaries, right? And they're unreliable. I think we've seen a lot of frustration from outside powers involved in the Libyan context with the reliability of their so-called proxies, right? Proxies can defect, they can get killed. And so we've seen that. Even in someone like General Haftar, there's a lot of frustration by his so-called regional patrons. And I think that's a key story in Libya. The origins of Gulf involvement, I think, are well known. We have to go back to the 2011 intervention, the Civil War, and look at also the U.S. role. The U.S. had so much importance placed on the investment of Gulf air forces from the Qataris and from the Emiratis. And the NATO-led intervention was where these air forces, finally came out and played an important role alongside NATO forces. But on the ground, as we know, they were competing. They were competing with arms, advisors on the ground. They were establishing important links with Libyan armed groups, with Libyan personalities that endure to this day. And it explains a lot of the sort of elite competition that we're seeing today. The same networks. When we look at Dabeba and his links to Qatar, those were forged during the 2011 revolution. The same thing with the Emirates and their links to certain factions like the Malegta brothers going through the western town of Zintan. After the fall of Gaddafi, you had a sort of lull, in the competition. You had a shift, I think, to behind the scenes influence. You had the 2012 elections. The Gulf states, they did try to shape that political context. Qatar, for instance, supported an Islamist party. But the important thing here is that, those ties of patronage, those ties of arms, of political support were always present, but they were under the table. And then, of course, they rose to the fore. They exploded into open proxy conflict starting in 2014. This is, I think, what we can term as sort of classic, proxy war, where you had local factions on the ground receiving arms from the warring regional parties. You also had these countries conducting airstrikes of their own, sending in special operations forces. The war also reverberated in the Gulf, right? You had Libyans residing in the Emirates that were arrested. And so again, this notion of spillover. The US role, I think, was incredibly important here. You did have some signaling going on at Camp David, from President Obama, telling the Gulf states, look, stop your regional rivalry. But I really want to emphasize this point. It was a very mild signaling. Why? Because the US needed the Gulf states on other regional portfolios like the Iran deal. And I really want to emphasize this. When I talk to US officials about, why aren't you taking a harder line, for instance, on the Emirates in Libya, there's this sense of a triage of priorities. Well, we need the Emirates on this particular regional file, Israel-Palestine. We need them on the Iran deal. And so Libya has sort of become a casualty, right? It's just not that important for the US to expend political capital. And I think that's why we can explain that it's opened up to this sort of rivalry. Now, of course, 2019, when Haftar launches his attack on Tripoli, we know that there was strong signaling again from the Trump administration, underscoring the importance of the US role. I think this phase really exemplifies an important turn in Gulf intervention or regional intervention in Libya. And this is the notion of direct involvement, that the Libyans are suddenly cut out of the equation. You've got foreign forces, regional forces, committing their own ground forces, their own drones, their own aircraft. And so when you talk to Libyans, you get the sense like this war is out of our hands, right? The regional states are now calling the shots. And so you've had a tremendous turn in the nature of intervention where, as we know, there are foreign mercenaries on the ground, backed or financed by Gulf states, namely the Emirates, allegedly funding the Wagner group. You've also had a quantum leap, I think, in the media war, right? These states are waging a very sophisticated social media campaign to include troll factories, media franchising, cutouts, very sophisticated. And I do want to underscore that this combination of, on the one hand, global disorder, global norms, plus technological innovations like drones, like the social media dimension, that has facilitated a very cheap type of intervention. There's no penalties for it, right? The embargo has been violated with impunity, no penalties. Now we're in the new era, 2021, post-pandemic. We've got a new administration in the U.S. That matters. But again, we've got to think about the issue of bandwidth, right? How much bandwidth does the Biden administration really have to address Libya, to address North Africa, and also the question of prioritization, right? The Emirates are incredibly important on other files, as we've seen in the Abraham Accords, other issues. And so how much capital is the U.S. willing to expend? In my remaining time, I just want to highlight some more ways of, avenues of influence that we've seen, from the Gulf states. And again, I think the important thing is it spans the spectrum of influence. We've got soft power. We've got, I think, an important religious dimension. And I can talk about this at length in terms of the religious dimension, in terms of Salafism, right? Under Gaddafi, the regime made an investment in promoting a very quietist form of Saudi Salafism known as Markhalism. That is now expanding its influence in Libya, a direct result partly of the Gaddafi era, but also increasing Saudi origin media and religious influence. So we've got the religious dimension, the soft power dimension, but we've also got hard power. Again, kinetic airstrikes, special operations raids, mercenaries on the ground. Where are we now with Libya? Again, we've got this government of national unity. We can argue in some sense that the rivalry or the sort of malign, intense influence, especially from the Emirates, have subsided. We just had Dbeibeh meet with MBZ. So there's these positive signs of pragmatism, but I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think we've still got a fundamental, fear in terms of this ideational insecurity coming, especially from the Emirates, a fear again of Turkey, but also a willingness to recognize that events have transpired on the ground where the Turks are in the driver's seat, right? They've played their cards very well, and so you're having a recalibration, from the Emirates. Moving forward, I'll just close with this. We've got elections coming up. We could be returning to a sort of managed rivalry along the lines of what we saw in 2012, where we do have things happening behind the scenes. The conflict has shifted from open military conflict to diplomatic maneuvering to shape the appointments of important Libyan institutions, especially institutions that control the financial levers, right? The Emirates has always been concerned about the character of control of Libya's central bank, that those oil funds could be used to divert funds to Islamist parties. So again, control of the financial levers, shaping the elections, is a restarting of military conflict, out of the question? No, I think it could happen. Again, we still have mercenaries on the ground, to include those that are funded by the Emirates. Just to close, again, I think the U.S. can play a key role here. We're seeing important behind the scenes signaling right now to the Emirates to try to divest themselves from the Wagner group. But again, I can say, I think I'll just conclude that we could still see managed competition, managed behind the scenes influencing of Libya's evolving political situation.
Thank you very much, Fred. It is indeed a very, let's say, key example, Libya, in trying, in a way, it's sort of like an X-ray, a very open and clear signs of this competing forces, and also, as you said, very interesting how the involvement, or the direct involvement of these regional powers has become so cheap, with, as you said, technology, but also a lack of sanctions or of penalties for meddling into or participating into proxy wars, such as, on the other hand, such as Yemen. We have a few minutes before heading to Irene Fernandez Molina, who will give us some conclusions. We are waiting for some to see some reactions also from our audience, but I will ask in the same order as we started, a short question. If you could keep also your answers short, so we can have more time in case we have more questions. So my first question for Fatiha would be, I mean, you did mention towards the end that there is a real potential for an increase in violent extremism in the region due to the participation of these regional powers, and also how they managed to play some of these neighboring Magreb countries, such as Algeria and Morocco, against each other. So if you could slightly develop on that point.
Okay. Yes, well, in fact, I very rapidly mentioned these potential factors of confrontation, but of course, it's not in the interest of Morocco and Algeria to have this kind of confrontation. But I see a revival a potential revival of violence through the issue of Western Sahara, because of the lack of opportunity for the Polisario, the lack of the possibility to have a political issue to this file, and unfortunately, the violence could be one of the exit, and this is one of the risk. And I think that the EU, and especially France, that is, of course, very closely attached to its Moroccan partner, have also a say in this evolution. So, for sure, for France, Algeria, and Morocco, we don't see any, of course, issue to violence, but the risk is extremely high, and we have to see the reality that France, except in Morocco, have lost most of its leverage in the other Maghrebi states, and especially it's especially true in Tunisia and also in Algeria. The Turkish presence is extremely important, be it economical, politically, or the industrial leverage, and this is one of the risk I have just mentioned in the end of my contribution.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Fatiha. We're starting to receive some questions, but I will first ask Cinzia. Both the last answer from Fatiha and Fred's conclusion pointed at Turkey as an actor that is on the driver's seat. We've had very recently sort of like a fallout between the Italian Prime Minister and the Turkish President. And there is consensus over the fact that you cannot snub Turkey these days. They have played their cards quite well. I don't know, in terms of your analysis of the geopolitics of infrastructures, how do you gauge Turkey's role in the region?
So let me sort of address this question very, very briefly, but in two parts. When we speak of infrastructures, we definitely have a Turkish role that is very clear. And as Fatiha said, it's particularly clear in a place like Algeria. And it's also significant in a place like Turkey. As Fred said before, of course, Turkey is very important in Western Libya and in a port like Misrata, having talks about energy infrastructures and so on and so forth. But it does remain a player with less financial and technical capability than another player like the UAE would be. This is counterintuitive because, of course, the UAE is a much smaller state. But as a matter of fact, if we talk specifically about capacity to develop infrastructures, Turkey is a little less, in a slightly less strong position. It is still a substantial actor. Then if we move towards, what to do, how to then deal with Turkey, of course, I mean, I would agree that you cannot snub Turkey as you cannot do with any very visible and relevant regional player. But what happened with the Italian Prime Minister is slightly different. There's also a personal element, in that the new Prime Minister of Italy is a person with a very long career at the highest level of governance internationally, which means that he really does not feel that he needs to mince his words too much, also because he's the head of a technocratic government. And so he feels it much easier, and because it has been part of his professional life till that point, to call an apple and really be quite blunt with his opinions. However, the full sentence of the Prime Minister was, we should call Erdogan a dictator because he thinks he is one, but that doesn't change the fact that we need to cooperate with dictators. And so it's an extremely pragmatic position that comes from a person that doesn't feel he needs to be overly diplomatic or political. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers the two parts question.
Thank you. Yeah, some criticisms did mention the fact that he might have autocratic trends, but he was, after all, an elected leader. Fred, I will ask you a question from our audience. Nureddin wants to know, to what extent a global power competition between the US and China will be shaping the future American engagement in the region? Is the US geopolitical shift to Asia Pacific making room for Russia and Turkey to exploit that vacuum for their benefits?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, and you know, obviously, I think it's instructive to look at the posture statement, as it's called, of the U.S. Africa Command, which is responsible for the Magreb. I mean, they are now defining great power competition as the framework through which they engage with the local, you know, partners in the Africa and also the Maghreb. And so that's instructive about how the US, or at least one component of the US government, views, you know, the great power encroachment in the Maghreb. You know, I think the debate is still out. The US is concerned, but I think there are voices in the US government that recognize the US still has, you know, a lot more leverage in this region in terms of security partnerships. You know, there's often the sense that, well, these countries are going to now turn to China or Russia for their arms. That could happen. There's going to be some diversifying. You know, I've seen certain proposals, you know, from the U.S. government that say, look, we need to counter, you know, China's growing influence in this region. And I think there's also voices pushing back saying, no, we're not going to adopt a Cold War, you know, framework for this. These countries are welcome to have a sort of mercantilist, you know, entree into this region. So the question the U.S. has to grapple with is, where are we going to push back? Where are we going to try to constructively engage these great powers? I don't have the answer right now, but I can say that there are these important discussions, you know, underway. That the Chinese, just to take an example, in Libya, for instance, they've all pursued a very careful hedging strategy, right? They have not tied themselves to one faction or the other. They've got enormous telecom infrastructure interests. They are now intending to open an embassy, but again, they're still, you know, in the backdrop. They've not been actively involved in this proxy war. Of course, they've sold weapons like the drones to the Emirates, but they're not involved. I will say, you know, there is a huge concern about Russia in Libya from AFRICOM, from the U.S. Military, that, you know, Russia has a militarized presence just on NATO's, you know, flank. The question about how to remove those Russian forces, I think, is being treated as part of a larger, you know, diplomatic settlement, a larger, you know, package of diplomatic resolution, you know, moving forward. And I think that's the great tragedy of this war, is that you had a close U.S. ally, the Emirates, a close U.S. security ally, that basically opened the door for a Russian militarized presence south of NATO's flank.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a couple of questions more from the audience. However, some of them might actually be better addressed for the second panel. One is the evaluation of the Tunisian democratic transitional process and how it might be successful or not. We have Youssef Sherif on the second panel that might want to develop that. I'm just voicing them in case you want to react before we head to Irene. Another question is about the Gulf states. If any other Gulf state will start getting closer to Israel. That question from Adrián Hidalgo. One question from Beatriz Polo is about the Saudi Arabia position on the readmission of Syria in the Arab League. Some of those questions, I don't know if you want to comment on those. There's one last question from Jose Manuel Fernandez. What is the balance sheet of the politics developed by the UN and the EU in order to promote intra-Maghreb trade and integration and to reduce tensions inside and between the different states? Well, that is quite probably a deep and long answer, but Cinzia, you want to react to at least one of those questions?
Yes, I want to have first mover advantage and tackle the easiest question. I think the one on Syria, because I think it's particularly interesting to see how the Saudis have basically acknowledged that Bashar al-Assad has won the war, and they have done so already for a couple of years. But they are still sort of unsure on what's the best strategy moving forward. I think a large part of the rationale as to why Saudi Arabia reached out to Russia, for instance, was that they wanted Russia to sort of be the sole winner in a way from the external players of the Syrian war, and in a way reduce the role of Iran in the country to the favor of Russia. So basically they were supportive of a greater Russian role in Syria, especially if it served to marginalize Iran from the country. That hasn't really worked out for the Saudis so far, despite some interest on the Russian side. And moving forward, I think there are a number of options on the table. And one of those options is to readmit Syria to the Arab League. That would sort of mean that the Saudis have espoused a little bit more the logic by the UAE, who have been saying for a while now that the way to reduce the Iranian influence in Syria is by providing Bashar al-Assad with hedging options, basically, and sort of provide him with an alternative partners in the Gulf monarchies that he could sort of use to counterbalance the Iranian influence. So the whole idea of bringing the Arab Shia back to the Arab fold rather than to the Iranian framework.
Thank you. Okay, so I will pass on the word to Irene Fernandez Molina is Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Exeter, which she joined in 2015. Her research deals with the international relations of the Global South, subalternity and Southern agency, foreign policies of dependent and authoritarian states, and with a regional focus on North Africa, as well as EU foreign policy and Euro-Mediterranean relations. She was previously also a research fellow at the European Neighborhood Policy Chair of the College of Europe, a Schuman Fellow at the Directorate General for External Policies of the European Parliament in Brussels. And she also was a PhD research fellow at the Complutense University here in Madrid. So Irene, you have a few minutes to sort of like wrap this up.
Thank you so much, Karim. Thank you, Casa, Árabe, Fundación Alternativas, for the opportunity and the challenge to summarize and sort of wrap up this wonderful panel. It's really hard to summarize everything in just a few minutes, but I think we've had three presentations that very, very nicely speak to each other and in a way cover all the aspects, all the matter that makes international politics. So I really, the academic in me, I really appreciated seeing a dialogue between the different dimensions of international politics, the material/political economy factors that Cinzia and Fatiha have touched upon, as well as the ideational power struggle. This interplay can be seen in quite a few examples that have been given by the speakers. I also appreciated the effort to make connections between different levels of analysis. And here is where I think I can say a few words. We've had a couple of points from Fred, Cinzia, about the global dimension and the global power shifts that explain a lot of what's happening in the relations between the Magreb and the Gulf, and the motivations because this panel was focusing on the motivations and the driving forces for Gulf intervention in the Maghreb. I guess we will have more of the Maghreb perspective in the second panel. So this global power shift is both ideational, has to do with this crisis of the liberal international order that everybody's speaking about right now, but it's also material, as Cinzia said, the rise of China and the growing size of trade between Europe and China has changed or revamped the importance of trade corridors and infrastructure corridors across the Mediterranean. And the other, or the link to this, is the issue of the decline of US hegemony, which is also both ideational and material. So this is the global background. Then another theme that ran through the three presentations concerns the competition, power competition between different Arab Gulf players in the Maghreb. This is something that, for instance, we could very clearly see in all of the examples that Cinzia mentioned about the ports, the digital infrastructure connections, and the energy connections in the eastern, central, and western corridors across the Maghreb. Another very clear example of this competition has to do with the link between domestic politics and regional politics in the Libyan conflict, and how we saw this first stage of Gulf intervention in the conflict, in the first stage of the conflict in Libya in 2011 with the first civil war. Then this turned into a more managed competition during the political transition stage, and ended up degenerating into full proxy war after 2014. Something really interesting about this is the role of individuals in channeling Gulf influence into Libyan politics. The role of individuals is something that Fatiha has also emphasized when she said that there's been a certain estrangement in the relations between Morocco and Saudi Arabia after the arrival to power of Mohammed bin Salman, due to his lesser familiarity with Morocco and with Moroccan networks. So this importance of individuals and individual networks is also something that all the speakers have referred to in one way or another. And I think I'm gonna stop here because I don't want to take more time, but I'm really looking forward to the next panel, because now we need to hear about the Maghrebi responses to all of these types of intervention and all of these power dynamics that are being played in their countries.
Thank you, Irene, for this executive summary, for also picking up all the threads between our three brilliant panelists. And many thanks to Fatiha Dazieni, to Cinzia Bianco, to Frederick Wary, thank you for being able also to give us share some of your time, and to connect from Paris, Berlin, Washington, and the UK. We will now head to the second panel. The second panel will have a different lineup. And we'll have connections from Tunis and Doha and Madrid. Bear with us less than a couple of minutes. We'll just change the configuration of our screens for our next guests. And my colleague, Ichazo Dominguez de Olazábal, will be with you very short. So thank you again. And remember, we have more. Unfortunately, we couldn't go as in-depth as we wanted due to lack of time, but we'll be back very, very shortly with the second panel, Regions in Transformation, Adjusting to New Social, Economic, and Political Realities.
Hello, all of you. Thanks so much for staying with us. This is such a pleasure to be working with Casa Árabe. I am representation of Fundación Alternativas, and particularly with such an amazing lineup of experts. This is a true honor, a genuine honor. Now we are going to start with the second session, which is entitled Regions in Transformation, Adjusting to New Social, Economic, and Political Realities. Our speakers are going to be, again, such an honor to have that kind of experts. Luciano Sakara, Yasmina Buzohor, Joseph Sharif, and wrapping up with the difficult task of summarizing all of the insights and all of the information we're having, Haizam Amira Fernandez. Afterwards, we are going to have two honorary speakers for the closing remarks. We are also looking forward to that because it is also an honor to have both of them with us, Ambassador James Moran and Jackie Al-Zubir. So this seminar, the starting point, confirmed by the first session's brilliant interventions and debates, is that it is increasingly essential to examine the Mediterranean context through a wider scope that encompasses regional dynamics in the Middle East and Africa, as well as global shifts. The Gulf presence in the region, we've seen that is not new, it's nothing new throughout the decades, but it has changed as of lately, and it has sometimes grown, and it has particularly become more complex. Our goal is to understand precisely through the prism of Gulf engagement in the Mediterranean a number of converging dynamics, mainly geopolitical competition and regional conflicts, but also domestic politics and political dynamics and advanced avenues, potential avenues, hopefully for cooperation. This session aims to look into the current development of the Gulf countries' multidimensional strategies in and towards the Magreb, as well as their consequences. As we have seen with the case of Libya, a distinct setting in this regard is represented by context of conflict. Additionally, we intend to look into the political arenas of Maghreb countries
which have also witnessed variable geometry interventions by Gulf Arab countries, oftentimes mirroring the Gulf's own fault lines. The engagement is also ideational, ideological. As Frederick said, it is about a model state. And let's not forget that we are talking about republics, but also about monarchies, and also about the importance of both individuals and elites. The Gulf Cooperation Council internal dynamics, particularly after the 2017 blockade of Qatar, have had repercussions throughout the whole so-called MENA region and beyond. Will this impact change, for example, as a consequence of the soul symbolized by the Al-Ula summit? Speaking of recent moves from the Gulf, what will be the impact of the so-called Abraham Accords as the normalization with Israel that Patty have mentioned? Other dimensions could also take on a renewed significance. I am thinking of political economy, and I'm so happy that Cynthia spoke about infrastructure, particularly in a post-pandemic scenario, and particularly taking into account this renewed centrality of the Mediterranean for global trade and new or reconfigured value chains. I'm thinking also about soft power and its different dimensions. I'm thinking about the role of non-Arab powers in areas of common interest to both the Magreb and the Arab Gulf. Fatih has pointed some of them from Turkey to China, passing through Russia. The resulting analysis might shed some light, hopefully, on the shifting stances of Maghreb and Gulf states in the face of new points of contention, and again, hopefully, new points of convergence. First, we have with us Luciano Sakara. He's a research assistant professor in Gulf politics at the Qatar University Gulf Studies Center and the director of the Observatory on Politics and Elections in the Arab and Muslim world in Spain. He has been assistant professor at Georgetown University in Casa, a visiting research scholar at the Center for Iranian Studies at Princeton University, and visiting researcher at the University of Exeter. He holds a PhD in Arab and Islamic Studies from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. He specializes in Gulf and Iranian politics and foreign policy, elections and political reform in Gulf Cooperation Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and international politics in the Persian Gulf. Afterwards, we are going to speak, as Irene was hoping, about Maghrebi domestic politics, but I think with Luciano, we are maybe going to be focusing on the Gulf once more. Luciano, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Ichazo and Karim, for inviting me to join this wonderful panel. The bar is too high now after the first panel. And as you say, I mean, I'm not an expert in the Maghreb, so I will focus more on the GCC. And the challenges that the GCC, I think they are facing and will face, and they have been facing since the Arab Spring until now, and that which challenges that also force the GCC government to take specific measures that at the end of the day created some of the problems we are witnessing in the Maghreb and in different regions of Africa, as we listened or heard in the first panel. I assume that we all agree on the fact that the GCC states were not immune to the Arab Spring. I mean, what the Arab Spring demonstrated is the GCC states, I mean, the 6 monarchies in the GCC state were not immune to the revolts, and that all the GCC governments were forced to use a combination of different strategies to guarantee the survival and the resilience of the political regimes and the elites in power. These 4 strategies were redistributive policies or economic reforms, limited political or institutional reform, reinforcement of the internal security frameworks, and reorientation of the foreign policy. I'm not going to detail them, but of course, it was possible to implement redistributive policies, increasing salaries of nationals, creating jobs in public sector, raising worker wages and benefits, implementing the national visions, because of the economy was not severely affected due to the Arab Spring. On the other hand, however, discussions about taxation, economic diversification, and nationalization of working labor force started to be debated in all the GCC states. We had also limited political reforms with elections, some institutional changes in elected chambers, changes in citizenship law and residency permits. In the third strategy, reinforcement of internal security, many laws about anti-terrorism, cybercrime, designation of terrorist group, as was mentioned before, the dissolution of parties, etc., took place. And for the reorientation of the foreign policy, which I think it was what we were discussing in the first panel, how the impact of the Arab Spring forced, to some extent, the GCC states to take different orientation in foreign policy to address their main security concerns and also to build up on the leverage that they were having already in some areas, but they tried to be maximized through active or more proactive foreign policy in Arab Spring or post-Arab Spring scenarios like Yemen, Syria, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, for instance. We all know that after this very proactive implementation of foreign policy in the GCC, several crises took place in the region. In 2014, we had the first diplomatic crisis within the GCC context between Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Emirates, and Qatar. And the second chapter of this rift was the blockade that started in 2017 and lasted until recently, until December. So the impact of the Arab Spring drove or triggered more proactive foreign policy in post-Arab Spring scenarios that included most of the Arab world and also the Horn of Africa. What happened now that since 2020 we have another big crisis, again, an external event that is affecting the GCC states, which is the COVID pandemic, that is forcing also again all the GCC states to implement a combination of these four strategies that I mentioned before: redistributive policies, limited political reform, reinforcement of the internal security frameworks, and reorientation of the foreign policy. The problem is, while the first crisis was not very harmful in economic terms, the second one, it is very, very harmful in economic terms. The main measures took in 2020 and 2021, they are focused on economic measures to tackle the negative effects of both the fall of the oil prices and export and reduction of the domestic economies, while in the Arab Spring, the salaries and wages were raised. In this case, subsidies started to be cut, taxation started to be implemented in a very shy way, but there is a lot of debate about that, reducing benefits to national and non-national workers, more protectionist national labor force, restriction of movements, restriction of migration policies. So all these measures taken by the GCC states are to some extent diminishing the capacity of the external capacity that the GCC state had after the Arab Spring in terms of foreign policy. According to my perception, there is no doubt that while after the Arab Spring, the GCC state found in the reorientation or the more proactive foreign policy a tool to gain more leverage and to regain legitimacy regionally and internationally through exporting their influence all over the Arab and Muslim world and African world. Now the economic constraints are forcing all the GCC states to focus on sustaining their own economies, sustaining their own economic and political models. We have to bear in mind that the GCC states are still very oil-dependent economies, despite the fact of diversification policies or any other vision that is started to be implemented. I mean, still the oil dependency is very high in all the GCC states. That they are models that they are very migrant dependent, with Qatar and UAE having around 85% of non-national working force, less if we compare with the Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. That they were, I mean, at least 2 or 3 of them, they were using or they were implementing transportation hubs models through Qatar Airways, Emirates, and Etihad, and of course this crisis is affecting them as well, and that they have some issues with the food security, all of them, even though they managed to survive. Here in Qatar also the blockade contributed to increase this kind of challenges as a result of the blockade that was imposed by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Emirates. So what I'm trying to say and to summarize a little bit about my ideas in this parliament, I don't want to discuss things that they were mentioned before. I think they were brilliantly discussed by the 3 previous speakers, is that while the Arab Spring did not represent a serious challenge for the GCC states in terms of foreign policy, actually it represented an opportunity to extend their power and to occupy the vacuum of power produced in most of the GCC post-Arab Spring scenarios. The COVID-19 contributed to reduce the scope of the range of the GCC countries' foreign policy, because of the restrictions that the economy or the economic grievances are imposed to these GCC countries. They are much more, I mean, if we go back to these 4 strategies that they mentioned before, we will, I think, witness more changes or more measures taken in the second area, which is the limited political reform, in order to tackle the effects of the COVID, rather than the redistributive policies, the reinforcement of internal security, and the reorientation of the foreign policy. Why? Because while the redistributive policies were not able to be implemented because of economic constraints, more demands or more concerns have been or are being raised by nationals in all of the GCC states. We have been witnessing how social network platforms like Clubhouse became form of discussion in most of the GCC states, and how this is making the debate to be politicized. However you understand politics, we have a lot of discussion about what is to be interested in politics and what is to be interested in internal politics. But on the other hand, we can see that to some extent, this represents demands to the governments about what the governments are doing or how the GCC governments are tackling the effects, the economic effects of this pandemic in the GCC, which at the end of the day represent also a concern for most of the local population here in the GCC. Just to mention 2 of these limited political reforms or impacts on the political or institutional frameworks, that we had elections in Kuwait recently in December. I mean, there are many things we can say about what happened in Kuwait, but you can hear in all the GCC states, in the rest of the GCC states, is that we don't want to follow the Kuwaiti model. Nobody wants to reproduce what is happening in Kuwait, which is this confrontation or permanent confrontation between the emir or the political power and an elected National Assembly. But recently, the National Assembly, we can say that it's mainly occupied by members of the opposition, which also can bring more political debate to the whole region. And last but not least, we are going to have for the first time in Qatar in October legislative elections, and the debate already started, even though we don't have enough information to discuss about it and do research about that. But this means that people or Qataris, mainly young Qataris, started to debate about what is expected from this. If this had happened after the Arab Spring, it would have been absolutely different. Now, the kind of debate we are witnessing, we can say is much more economic or politically oriented rather than more internationally oriented as it was after the Arab Spring. With this, I'm going to stop. So I'll leave the floor for other colleagues, and I'm waiting for your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Luciano. That was brilliant. I really enjoyed how you went from this idea of guaranteeing the survival of regimes after the so-called Arab Spring in terms of ideology, in terms of security, but it went much beyond, and that's what we've seen in the first session, how all of these Gulf Arab countries have intervened or are engaged with North African or with the whole of the Mediterranean in different dimensions, the political economy and others. But guaranteeing the survival of regimes after the COVID, particularly taking into account the impact of the pandemic, is going to be even much harder when you talk about sustainability, and this is going to be key when we look at the Arab Gulf states, but also when we look at some Maghreb states. That's, for example, I'm thinking of Algeria and how it is going to diversify, how it is going to be able to diversify their economy. I'm thinking of Tunisia, I'm thinking of Libya, of course, and its reconstruction, and who is going to help reconstructing the country. And I'm even thinking about Morocco. And speaking of Morocco, we have with us the second panelist. She's Yasmina Bouzahor. She's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center and the European Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior fellow at the Moroccan Institute for Policy Analysis. Her research revolves around authoritarian persistence and transition, focusing on regimes' strategic, economic, and political behavior and their interactions with opposition movements, with a particular focus on monarchical survival and behavior. We spoke about monarchical survival, and this is going to be maybe one of the threads we could pursue in the debate. Geography-wise, Jasmina's research touches on both the Magreb and the Gulf regions. She received her PhD in politics from the University of Oxford, and she's going to also share with us a presentation. And I'm really looking forward to listening to your speaking. Jasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to wait for you to load the presentation. But thank you in the meantime for having me, and thank you to my fellow presenters for their valuable contributions. It's a rudimentary presentation, but I hope you can follow. So I can't see if it's on or not. Maybe you can help me with that. Oh, there it is. Great. Perfect. So I'm going to speak briefly about Maghreb Gulf relations today, and then about Morocco in detail. So just moving on to the second slide, please. Thank you. So as it was mentioned earlier, relations between the Maghreb and the Gulf have gone through several ups and downs over the last decade. And I'm choosing to look at them since the Arab Spring, because I think that's when the most developments happened, and then looking through to the breakthrough in Al-Ula between the Gulf states. But the 2011 uprisings deepened the Gulf countries' interest in the Maghreb. They represented a threat to the monarchies on domestic and regional levels, and countries like Saudi Arabia sought to intensify their relationship with Maghreb states, first because they aimed to counter the perceived rising Iranian influence in the region, and then because they wanted to avoid the rise of further Islamist leadership in North Africa after Al-Nahda had come to power in Tunisia and the Muslim Brotherhood had done so in Egypt. And finally, in the aftermath of the uprisings, the GCC states, and this was mentioned earlier, are all monarchies, and they aim to form a sort of loose monarchical alliance. We're not quite sure why at this point, but most likely to counter the growing republicanism in the broader region. And so this explains, of course, the membership invitation extension to Morocco and Jordan, as well as, importantly, the $5 billion in aid pledged to each one of them. And yet, despite these strengthened ties, the last decade has seen rising tensions, especially since the Gulf crisis. These are probably linked to divergences in terms of foreign policy orientation and political ideology. However, they did rise, especially with Morocco, after the Maghreb states' neutral stance during the Gulf crisis. And when Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt imposed the blockades, all these states were faced with pressures to pick a side, though unofficially, and they chose to strike a delicate balance between preserving ties with Doha without alienating the Saudi Emirati bloc. and none felt this issue more than Morocco, which I was asked to talk about today, which more importantly is arguably the Maghreb state closest to the Gulf in terms of economic, diplomatic, and leadership ties. So this talk today will focus on the evolving relationship between Rabat and the Gulf. We'll examine the sporadic tensions faced in recent years, and we'll discuss a post-Al-Ula and post-COVID-19 outlook. So just the next slide, please. Thank you. We know that Morocco maintains a close relationship with the Gulf, as we discussed earlier, and this intensified since 2011. While the Gulf states' desire to deepen ties was motivated by the regional geopolitical considerations I just mentioned, Moroccan decision makers were motivated by the kingdom's economic and diplomatic policy interests. In terms of economic interests, Morocco benefits greatly from Gulf investment, aid, trade. And I alluded to this earlier. In 2011, the GCC pledged $5 billion in aid to Morocco to fund development projects. So far, mainly Qatar has come through, according to Moroccan policymakers, but we don't have enough data to see whether Saudi Arabia and the UAE sent through the aid. And still, Saudi Arabia takes the lead in terms of most aid promised and delivered overall since 2011. In fact, in 2016, Saudi Arabia signed a deal worth $230 million in aid to Morocco. There's little discussion of major aid deals right now, but that's largely due to the implications of decreased oil prices as well as the coronavirus pandemic. And as we know, GCC states also invest heavily in the kingdom. And according to the latest data we have from 2019, close to 40% of Morocco's foreign direct investment came from the Gulf. And a significant portion of this investment is calculated to go to real estate, with the UAE coming out on top, as well as hotel businesses, with major deals struck with Kuwait. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia recently pledged to invest $22 billion in Morocco's military. And here it is worth remembering that Morocco has provided security training and military support to the Gulf on several occasions in the past under both monarchs. Finally, its relationship with the GCC monarchies boosted Morocco's foreign policy. Predictably, in terms of diplomatic interests, this has much to do with the disputed territory of Western Sahara. And Gulf states have been more forthcoming and vocal than others in supporting Morocco's claim, especially after the recent partial normalization with Israel. Also importantly, however, when looking at the broader picture, this relationship has allowed Morocco to diversify its alliance base away from Europe and to become less dependent on EU influence and support. This, of course, goes hand in hand with Rabat's reorientation towards Africa over the last 5 years, as well as its move towards less traditional partners such as China, and there has been talk about a partnership with Russia. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these tensions were mostly manifested through pulling out ambassadors on both sides, refusing to meet with officials, again on both sides, and hostile rhetoric via social media, especially from the UAE towards Morocco, and on state television, especially in Saudi Arabia. For example, documentaries airing questioning Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is a big no-no for the kingdom. Morocco eventually pulled troops from the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And overall, the growing relationships and security cooperation with Qatar has greatly angered Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. This all happened since 2017 and is generally thought to be related to the Gulf crisis. However, many experts have pointed out that there is a kind of discord at the top between the leaderships. And the relationship was much smoother under when King Salman was in power. So that's something people point to. Despite these tensions, due to recent developments, the future seems brighter. So the final slide, please. These events are ongoing or recent, and so it's hard to predict, but it would be reasonable to think that Morocco-GCC ties may become stronger, or at least that there will be fewer tensions. This is mainly because many of the issues at the root of these tensions have resolved themselves or been resolved. Although GCC states have yet to heal from the wounds of the Gulf crisis, the latter is partially resolved. It is resolved to the extent that Rabat will not have to face pressures to pick sides. The Libya dossier is seeing significant developments at the present, and the prospects of a hopefully unified country will reduce the avenue for discord between Morocco on one side and major Gulf players like the UAE and Qatar on the other, and to a lesser extent, Saudi Arabia. In this dossier in particular, Morocco will likely continue to support the UN's position on Libya, to emphasize the Skhirat Agreement of 2015, which was signed in Morocco, and to promote inter-Libyan dialogue and advocate against foreign interference, read from outside of the region. This approach mainly promotes Morocco's own foreign policy interests. It's removed from its ties with the Gulf. We can discuss this later in Q&A, but it strengthens its credibility as a regional mediator and its value towards Western actors. Other developments will help the relationship along, and here we're mainly talking about the Abraham Accords and Morocco-UAE ties specifically. Interestingly, something that is not discussed a lot is that this partial normalization with Israel may give Morocco back some of its Hassan II era importance in terms of mediating the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. This is a position which Moroccan decision makers gradually lost over the last 2 decades, and they have been vocal about being keen to get back on it. In more immediate terms, this all translates into less tensions and less hostility. And going forward, if we wait out the pandemic and the decreased oil prices, there will likely be an increase in Gulf investment, trade, and aid packages to Morocco, especially when we consider the Gulf security interests and considerable investments in the kingdom. But for now, bilaterally, Rabat will focus its efforts on strengthening ties with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, mainly to promote its own economic and diplomatic interests. And as a side note, deepening ties with Riyadh will be viewed as a move to counter potential Algerian influence in the Gulf region. The relationship with Qatar will remain strong, and Doha will view Morocco's neutrality and slight favoritism as something to be thankful for. Moroccan decision makers continue to cast themselves as dependable allies for Qatar. And overall, despite triggering short-term tensions, which 2-3 years ago seemed almost catastrophic, Rabat's decision to maintain neutrality will pay off and is in fact doing so right now. I'm going to end here, but I'm eager to take up any of these points later in Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jasmina. It was really great. You touched upon all of the points that I mentioned. Like, I'm not going to have any questions afterwards. I will for sure. So I really enjoyed how you broke down all of the exchanges, because we could also see everything. For example, Cynthia and Fatiha were speaking about the political economy, you spoke about real estate, but also the military. I also appreciated this idea that Morocco has been diversifying its allies, pulling away from Europe, but still with a close link with Europe in commercial terms. Irene could speak on that regard, but looking at Africa and Africa and Morocco's African regional policy has been a model for other North African countries. Correct me if I'm wrong, for years now. It could lead to conflict. Let's hope that's not the case, but that has also strengthened links with Russia and with China. I also noticed when you say that relations were smoother with King Salman. I think everything was smoother with King Salman, with his predecessor. But maybe that's going to change. And I really enjoyed how you spoke about about potential avenues for cooperation, about how Morocco could become a regional mediator. Let's hope for that. And instead of just speaking about complexity and contention, maybe we could speak about a shared vision for the Mediterranean and even for the rest of the African continent. And now we are going to speak about Tunisia, hopefully, or maybe other countries as well. We have with us Joseph Sharif, a friend of ours. He runs the Colombia Global Center in Tunis. He is a political analyst, member of Carnegie's Civic Activism Network, and a regular contributor to numerous think tanks specializing on North African affairs. He consulted previously, amongst others, for institutions such as the United Nations and the Casa Center. He is a former expert at the Tunisian Institute for Strategic Studies. He holds a Achievement in Masters of Art in International Relations from the Department of World Studies of King's College London, and a Fulbright Master of Arts in Classical Studies from Columbia University. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Yes, I'll speak about Tunisia. And actually, during the last decade, Tunisia has been surfing on Gulf rivalries. The relationship between Tunisia and the Gulf states can actually be summarized in the following 5 points. 1, Tunisia is important to the Gulf states because of its proximity to Libya. 2, there is a clear media focus by the Gulf states on Tunisia, and therefore there is a full strategy that the Gulf states or the media outlets of the Gulf states are enacting towards Tunisia. And here I'm talking about Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, Al Hadath, Sky News Arabia, and so on. And in this strategy, I can summarize it in 2 aspects: the Emirati and the Qatar. In one aspect, the Emirati and the Qatari media demonize each other's plans in Tunisia, and they consequently delegitimize each other's allies or clients in the country. And by extension, they contribute in the political polarization in Tunisia. So the importance of Libya, the importance of Tunisia because of Libya, the media strategy. There are also some economic ties between the Gulf states and Tunisia, mostly economic investments and donations from Qatar and donations from Saudi Arabia. So this is on the economic level. There are high-level visits between Tunisian leaders and Qatari and Saudi leaders. So again, no investments and no donations from the UAE, and no visits, no high-level visits with the UAE. And finally, the 5th point are the ongoing rumors, because I don't have confirmations, about Qatari and Emirati funding directed towards opposing political groups. So it is possible that the Qataris and the Emiratis are funding political parties in Tunisia, but I don't have proofs for this. So this summarizes the relationship and the importance of Tunisia and how for the Gulf states and how Gulf states are working in Tunisia. Now, before going country by country, I just want to specify that when we talk about Tunisia, there is a difference. There is a major difference between it and the neighboring countries, especially Yasmina was talking about Morocco. So there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences, not least the fact that 1, Tunisia is a democracy, and 2, Tunisia is a democracy where power is actually divided. So while in Morocco, you can talk about the vision or the strategy of the Moroccan state, in Tunisia, you have Ennahda, the largest political party in the country, that has good ties with Qatar, for instance, but that doesn't mean that the president of the republic has good ties with Qatar, and so on. Same with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, same with the Ministry of Defense. They have their own strategies and their own visions, and they do not necessarily obey to Ennahda as the largest political party in the country, and they sometimes have their own views about with whom the relationships should be better or worse. So now we go country by country, and I'll start by Qatar. Obviously, Tunisia got closer to Qatar in the last 10 years. 1, because of Ennahda's proximity to Doha, which facilitated grants and loans to Tunisia. There are more than 1.5 billion grants and loans that came from Qatar to Tunisia since 2011. And 2, because of Tunisia's importance for anyone active in Western Libya. And here Qatar has high interests in Western Libya. So there is a clear proximity between Tunisia and Qatar. Therefore, Qatar is the largest investor in Tunisia, the 2nd largest foreign direct investor after France. Although we're not talking about major investments. I mean, Tunisia being the smallest North African economy, or the smallest economy between Morocco and Egypt, so the investments are not very big. But whatever is coming from Qatar is providing jobs, pumping cash in Tunisia's central bank, giving Tunisia diplomatic backing, and so on. As I said, Ennahda leaders and intellectuals have a positive view on Qatar, while in general there is a strong resentment against Qatar among any anti-Ennahda group in the country. So in the past it was among Nida Tunis constituencies. Now it is with the current opponents of Ennahda, who are always very critical of Qatar. So that's kind of a rallying point for Ennahda opponents to oppose Qatar. the relationship in the last few years, as I said, got closer, but there were ups and downs. Since the elections of 2019, Tunisia has been ruled by Ennahda as the leading party in parliament, and President Kais Saied, who is his own political figure, who doesn't have a political party, but who, according to the constitution, is the one leading the foreign affairs of the country. Clearly, Ennahda and its leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, went closer and wanted Tunisia to be closer to Qatar and Turkey, especially in 2019, 2020, when Turkey was fully into Libya and moving into Libya. But that the president refused it. And it actually added to the animosity or the hostility of the president towards Rashid Ghannouchi, who is the parliament speaker. And the crisis is ongoing until now. In November 2020, the president visited Qatar, and there was a clear attempt by the Qataris to co-opt him. A lot of fanfare and a lot of out of protocol privileges were given to the president. He was awarded a prize. He was given the honorary presidency of a newly created organization, and so on. But it didn't work. It didn't work that well, and his relationship with Ghannouchi deteriorated even more after he came back to Tunisia. Now, about Qatar, I would just conclude by saying that the ties between Qatar and Ennahda remain strong, and in a way, Tunisia is kind of a Qatari success story. So, and Tunisia is always seen under positive lights by Qatari media outlets. And as I said earlier, Tunisia is right next to Libya, where Qatar has a lot of interest. So as long as there is no staunch anti-Qatari regime established in Tunisia, the country will remain close to the Qatari orbit. Now, it will be shorter when I'll talk about the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but over the years, the different Tunisian leaders tried at multiple occasions to build better ties with the Saudis and the Emiratis. However, the relationship with the UAE remained cold, and Qatari, as well as pro-Ennahda media and social media outlets, often accuse the UAE of attempting to destabilize Tunisia. There was not a single meeting between MBZ and a Tunisian president since 2012, at least. And the visits of Tunisian officials to the UAE have been rare. Very rare, actually. There are now talks about a possible visit by President Kais Saied to the UAE, but it's not yet confirmed. There are often rumors about the Emiratis funding Tunisian political groups. In the past, it was about Nida Tunis, and now that period is becoming history, we see more and more Nida Tunis leaders coming out about Emirati funding. And there are now rumors about Emirati funding to a group that is fully opposed to Ennahda and openly opposed to Ennahda, and actually sometimes avoiding to criticize the UAE. But again, this is only at the level of rumors. Still, it is noticeable that the UAE never classified Ennahda as a terrorist organization, and contacts are not totally cut between Emiratis and the Ennahda leaders. So there is this is not a total dead end. To summarize about the UAE and Tunisia, I would say that the animosity between Ennahda leaders and the Emiratis seems to continue so far. It is linked to the broader Emirati campaign against political Islam, and also because the Emiratis think that Ennahda is actually playing against their interests in both Tunisia and Libya, maybe more importantly in Libya. So as long as the UAE is involved in Libya, as long as the UAE is fighting Qatari and Turkish interests in Libya and elsewhere, ties with Tunisia will continue to be bad. My last section is about Saudi Arabia. And here the relationship with Saudi Arabia is actually different from the one with Qatar and the one with the UAE. Official visits have been quite regular, especially during Qais Sipsi's time, so between 2015 and 2019. at the level of heads of state, Crown Prince from Saudi Arabia, ministers, etc., etc. But not only. Ennahda leaders, often Ennahda is portrayed as very opposed to the Saudis, but actually no. Ennahda leaders used to go quite regularly to Saudi Arabia, apart from the year 2011, and then apart from 2016 on with the rise of MBS. Actually, the Ennahda leaders try as much as possible not to be critical of the Saudis. Now, it depends, but you never hear Ennahda leaders criticizing the Saudis in their war in Yemen, for instance. Also, partly in order to appease Saudi Arabia, the Tunisian leaders are very wary of any extra rapprochement with Iran. Even though the Iranians always try to build closer ties with Tunisia. So as I say, the relationship are quite good with the Saudis. I count more than $1 billion in grants and loans that came from Saudi Arabia in the last 10 years. There are many aspects of mutual visits, joint military exercises, etc., etc. Tunisians, as I said, give high importance to Saudi Arabia, one, because of the potential for economic relations and the development aid that can come from Saudi Arabia, and two, because of the importance of the Hajj for Tunisian Muslim citizens, especially now that Tunisia is now a democracy. So if Saudi Arabia stops the Hajj, that can be very bad for any Tunisian government. So for the Saudis, as long as Tunisia is not siding with Iran and not attempting to play with their internal politics, they are fine. And that's why I think Ennahda has been very cautious when dealing with Saudi Arabia. And I think the relationships will remain as they are in the upcoming years. Now, to conclude, the bickering that I mentioned between the two camps in Tunisia, especially between Qatar and the UAE, has slowed the democratic transition in the country and derailed several local and European plans for building democratic institutions and the rule of law. But as a positive conclusion, I'm trying to look into the future, and I think that the détente in the Qatar crisis may lead to changes, to positive changes. The Turks and the Qataris could feel less interested in Libya and by extension Tunisia. They also see the difficulties that their allies face in Tunisia and therefore can become less supportive of them in the future. On the other hand, the Emiratis may feel less interested in Libya and decide to be less proactive or less hostile towards Tunisia. So the two sides will attack each other's clients and allies less in the media, and that will decrease the polarization in Tunisia. And so I think we have to wait, but from what I see, the current détente in the Gulf will have positive impacts in Tunisia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joseph. But that was brilliant. All of the sections and the breakdown also by countries that has been so enlightening. So I'm going to ask some questions to the panelists, and afterwards we will move to the Q&A by the public. So first, Luciano. So if I understood right, so you were saying that the Gulf countries the Arab Gulf countries might be thinking about downgrading their influence or the intervention in some of the countries, in the Magreb countries and in Africa. I'm asking myself whether they can afford to do that after having invested so much in terms of infrastructure, in terms of other economic investments, and this is an open question. I understand why, but I'm not sure this is a possibility, and maybe you have the answer. And also because you're an expert in Iran, I was wondering whether you could shed some light, because that could also have an impact in the future on this strange event that took place in 2018. I remember I was in Iran at that time when Morocco had when all of the news were full of references to Morocco, to the rivalry between Morocco and Iran, and Morocco being about to cut relationships with Iran related to something about Hezbollah. It was not clear for me and maybe it was clear for you. And maybe if we look into the future, and we've seen news today about the Israel and Iran escalating tensions again, even if that is regular, that leads somebody to question whether that could lead to a more intense conflict, even though it hasn't happened in the past, and whether that could impact both the Gulf countries and the relationship, their foreign policies in other areas, particularly in the Mediterranean and even in the African continent. And somebody was asking in the public, and maybe you've heard that question so many times before, but I have to give it to you. What are the Gulf Cooperation Council going to do if they are faced with the same protests, uprisings, and demands that most North African countries had to face in 2011 and afterwards?
Do you want me to reply all of the questions?
You can choose. I just picked three of them for you to choose the one you're most comfortable with.
Yeah, well, I will try to address all of them. Demands, of course, there are demands, and they will be. The problem is I don't think it will be the same nature. Now the concerns are more economic. So as far as the governments are addressing, and that's what's my point. I mean, while before they were trying to address directly the economic concern through sending money to the people, I mean, giving money, I mean, extending the social contract. I think what is now under discussion is how a social contract like this is sustainable when the resources of the state are going down. And I think this is the main challenge here, or how they can channel some of the previous benefits that they were doing in an economic way in another way, like increasing participation, increasing other kind of benefits for citizens while they are taking some of the economic benefits. And it's already happening, and the debate is already there. If this will drive to institutionalized opposition or debate, it's something that we are going to see, at least here in Qatar in October. If it's going to drive to a more violent uprisings like it happened in Bahrain, Oman, or Kuwait, there's something that, I mean, I wish I can predict it. I mean, I didn't mean that the GCC states will reduce their interest in economic terms in the Magreb or in the Horn of Africa or in the North of Africa. But I mean, many of you have referred about kind of financial support to political parties, to different groups to implement their own agenda in foreign policy in different scenarios of Arab Spring. I think this is going to be reduced. I mean, actually, it's happening because of different external pressures. I mean, most of the GCC states were subject to FATF. I don't remember the acronym of this international system to prevent money laundering and support to terrorism. So this, in any way, even though, again, there is no official information about how this money was transferred, to whom it was transferred, there was money transferred from most of the GCC states to different actors in post-Arab Spring scenarios. Of course, this has to be reduced because of external constraints and because there is not enough money to distribute. Of course, the priority will be given to infrastructural projects that can benefit economically the GCC states, but that they will not increase the political influence. This is my take. I'm not sure if this is going to be the end of the story or not. And regarding Iran, we can talk a lot of time about Iran. We are going to have elections in June. So far, I don't see that there's going to be any further improvement in the US-Iran relations regarding the JCPOA. So I assume that until August, we will not see any big step taken by any of the two actors. And as far as this is not happening, nothing is going to change in Iran-GCC relations. We have to bear in mind that the blockade ended, and this is a huge development in Gulf politics. And the normalization with Israel also meant something, even though it didn't mean, I mean, it doesn't seem to have affected in a very drastic way Iran approach to the GCC states. So for some people in Iran, this made clear who is in one camp and who is on the other. And as far as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait are not signing, Iran will not have a different stand to any of those GCC states. And again, as far as Qatar is in one safe place in terms of mediating between Iran and the United States, as far as we know, I mean, there have been a lot of rumors about how Qatar can play a role in mediating between these two states. I think the situation is not going to change drastically in regard of Iran approach to the 6 GCC states. But again, this is a subject of long discussion.
Thanks so much, Luciano. Yasmina, your turn. I was thinking that one of the first actions of the GCC after the so-called Arab Spring was trying to inviting Morocco and Jordan, the other two monarchies of the region, into the GCC. I don't remember if it was as members, as observers. It was not clear. Nowadays, after the clear idea behind that move was, of course, guaranteeing the survival of the monarchies, seeing the republic falling one after the other. Nowadays, after the events in Jordan, I'm not sure I should be talking about coup. Maybe somebody could cast some more light on Jordan. Do you think that there is also a new feeling of threat in terms of monarchical survival? Both in Morocco or in some of the Arab Gulf countries?
Thank you. These are very interesting questions. The subject of my PhD dissertation. So if I get started, I never stop. So all of you. Well, we all thought the invitation to Morocco and Jordan to join the GCC was kind of out of the right lane, because especially Morocco, which is distant geographically speaking, but both countries are different in terms of the political system, as well as, the economic system, so on and so forth. So I don't think it was a move to guarantee survival, but it was definitely a move to signal to the rest of the region, this is an alliance, we have each other's backs. Of course, they didn't want any monarchy to fall because of the potential domino effect, but I think it was more of a foreign policy posturing, in my opinion. Very interesting events in Jordan, and very difficult to tell what's going on because the domestic press has a hard time covering it, and the international press is, of course, predicting and positing a lot, but the data is not available. I would not call it a coup. I would say, this was fear from, as far as I can tell, from the regime because of growing public dissidence. I think the targets were more so Basma and other people than Prince Hamza. But of course, the focus was on the prince because of the talk of an attempted coup. But I think we can tell now that the straw that broke the camel's back was Prince Hamza talking to tribal leaders as well as families of the people who died 3 weeks ago, the COVID patients, because of oxygen shortages in Jordan's hospitals. But I think if we look at this, along with the trend in Jordan, as well as the other monarchies, the growing trend of repression, the heightened targeting of critical voices, be it through judicial proceedings, be it through campaigns criticizing these opposition actors, or be it through talks of attempted coups, I think we can see a clampdown on public opinion in general. And Jordan doesn't escape this, although it's always viewed as one of the more liberal monarchies, along with Morocco. So to answer your last question, is there a threat to monarchical survival? I always disliked the focus on monarchical survival, because if we look at the Arab Spring in general, it's, the whole monarchies versus republic dimension, perhaps I'm the last person who should say this given my research, but it kind of misses the point, that these are authoritarian regimes of different categories who treated different levels of protests in similar ways, using similar strategies, cooptation, concession, and repression, of course. I think that we can talk about threat to the regime because, we spoke earlier about social contracts. Their promises in the Arab Spring, all of them made promises of liberalization to different extents, and none of them have really kept up with them, especially the monarchies especially. And I think these are catching up with them. I think if you look at protests in Oman in 2018, 2019, I think if you look at regular protests in Bahrain because of repression, protests in Jordan because of the economy, but also, the failure to target certain corrupt officials, and protests in Morocco that some of them were smaller scale, but also regional scale protests in the Rif, so on and so forth. I think, populations, opposition actors, interest groups it's not that they're beginning to catch on, they've always caught on, it's that they're fed up with not having these promises respected by the regimes. And so it's time for these monarchies to readapt the social contract. Whether they will or not depends on whether they are motivated to do so or not. We'll see, but that's my reading of it.
Thanks so much. I so agree with the idea that they should remodel the social contract. I think we all agree with that, but the incentives to do so might be more tricky. Particularly, we take into account the structural and the obstacles that could be posed by the elites, not by the authorities themselves. And we all know how the structure of the elites work in these countries. So, Youssef, I have two questions for you. One is related to Libya. We've spoken about the Gulf rivalry and Gulf intervention in the conflict in Libya, but hopefully we are going to see a transition to peace, inshallah, and all of the inshallah in the world. But that leads me to think about reconstruction and who's going to intervene in the reconstruction. This debate is already on the table concerning Syria, and this is why so many people believe that the United Arab Emirates and other countries are pushing for Syria to be normalized and to be included in the Arab League so that they could profit from the reconstruction. Do you see similar moves, similar dynamics regarding the reconstruction of Libya? And the other question comes from the public, and I believe it is a very good question by Albert Vidal. Keeping in mind the close France, the United Arab Emirates alignment, how has France's large economic clout in Tunisia affected the way Tunisia deals with Qatar and the United Arab Emirates?
So regarding Libya, actually, the reconstruction in Libya will happen even quicker than the one in Syria, because in Libya, in Syria, you still have a lot of heavily armed extremist organizations. You still have the involvement of different countries, and it's far from over. In Libya, it's been a year of almost peacefulness, apart from a few attacks here and there. But all in all, life has kind of resumed normally. There are a lot of foreign leaders who are visiting Libya on an almost weekly basis, and the scramble for Libya has started between European countries, but also with Turkey fully in, with Egypt, and yesterday or the last 3 days, the Tunisian president was actually in Egypt. Some people say that he was there because he wanted to find some agreement with the Egyptians about what to do in Libya, but I don't think the Egyptians are interested. So there are all these countries that are now, they see the market for reconstruction in Libya, and who are sending in their diplomats, their technical officers, and their companies to prospect in Libya. Actually, Tunisia could play an important role because of the neutral role it played during the Libyan war, and because of its proximity to Western Libya, but I don't know whether Western companies will be using Tunisia or not, because it's always easier to work on Libya from Tunisia than than in Libya proper because of the transport and everything. Now, the second question is about France and the UAE, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So it didn't really, France did not put pressures on Tunisia to be closer to the UAE, but France was clearly not happy to see Turkey and Qatar becoming more and more influent in Tunisia. And this is not at all related to the UAE because France has a much deeper relationship and connection to Tunisia than the UAE. I mean, listen to my accent. I speak almost like a Frenchman. And so that's something that is very strong in Tunisia, and it goes beyond the UAE. So there is an alliance of circumstances between the UAE and France, because France is opposed to the role played by Turkey and Qatar, but it's not because of the UAE that France is taking a specific role in Tunisia, and it so happens because of this alliance of circumstances that France did back most Ennahda opponents in the country, and that France is not seen as a particularly pro-political Islam or pro-democratic transition in Tunisia.
Thanks so much, Youssef. That has been short and sweet, and I was expecting that from you. We don't have time for further questions. I'm really sorry for the people in the public who have asked questions, really interesting questions to the speakers. We will, of course, let the speakers know about the questions so that they could see the reflection process, the thinking process. That's for sure. That's what these debates and these events are for as well. And now, sorry, apologies. Now, our friend Haidam Amira Fernandez is going to wrap up his amazing session. He is a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute, an associate professor at the Instituto de Empresa. He has a BA from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid and an MA in Arab Studies on a Fulbright scholarship from Georgetown University Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. He has lectured at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Georgetown University, San Luis University, Universidad San Pablo CEU, and the Universidad de Barcelona. He has also worked for the United Nations in New York and for Human Rights Watch in Washington, D.C. Haidam, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Itxaso, and thanks a lot to Casa Árabe and to Fundación Alternativas for having me. I think it's been very interesting session and with great presentations looking into two regions in transformation, the Gulf and the Maghreb. It's very difficult to draw conclusions in 5 minutes, but I'll try to raise some points based on the presentations that we just listened to. So two regions in transformation, and the need to adjust to new social, to new economic and political realities. Obviously, part of the transformation has to do with the changing dynamics in both inside certain countries and regional dynamics and the international system. All that combined with the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is still having and will continue to have on different parts of the world. And I think this is a factor that needs to be highlighted. You know, maybe if we have more time, I'm sure that in presentations that would have been more present. Also, the need to adjust to new realities. If I may be mistaken, but maybe then we haven't heard much about the U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Gulf, where the U.S. has played for decades the major role, foreign power, and you know, less so in the Maghreb, but also the last U.S. administration has had its impact, both because of the methods, the way in which the Trump presidency or administration has functioned, allowing Gulf countries to jump in and fill some vacuums, extending their influence, projecting their power beyond their region, beyond the Gulf, but also the impact of the Trump administration in North Africa. And I think there's something very visible in the last minute decision by the Trump administration to basically announce a presidential proclamation recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara disputed territory. So the waves of revolts, and when talking about the need to adjust to new economic and social realities, people still talk about the Arab Spring, the 2011, the first wave that produced transformations in certain Arab countries. In my opinion, it has not ended yet, if we consider it like a process that will be there for a long time because of the root causes that made people take to the streets and squares. Back in 2011, we saw it again in other countries in 2019. I think we're still in a period where, those demonstrations of frustration, basically, the need for new states and systems, we will continue to see the consequences of these new waves of Arab revolts after the health emergency ends in a way. Now, and that's Luciano Zaccara talked about the economic constraints in GCC countries because of issues of revenues, state revenues, etc. That is also happening in the Maghreb region. We're seeing it very clearly in the case of Tunisia, Morocco. We're seeing it also in Algeria, despite the differences in their economic structures and sources of revenues. We're seeing that these countries, for different reasons, have been hit hard due to different factors. The pandemic has exacerbated some of the factors that were already producing economic insecurity for a large number of people in this society. So the question is, for how long will the effects of the health emergency continue to affect the countries both in the Maghreb and also in the Gulf, the Arab Gulf of GCC countries, and that combined with new dynamics, one of them being a new US administration, the Biden administration, and how it will deal with Gulf monarchies and strong men in the Gulf. I'm sure, we're already seeing there's a difference in the way of dealing or the family relations that existed under Trump and his son-in-law, and also how the Biden administration is gonna deal with North Africa, with threat perceptions to the security, to the stability, working maybe closer with other allies, traditional allies of the US. That is something that under Trump was simply, US allies would learn about Trump decisions via Twitter. We're not going to see that anymore, at least, for the coming 2 or 3 years or so. And also the idea of diversifying alliances, and this is something that was mentioned by Yasmina Abu Zuhur, the diversification away from Europe. This is a trend that we're already seeing. I think in the next the closing remarks in the next session, we will hear more from two people who know a lot about that. What's the role for the EU, which was traditionally the main partner in North Africa? That diversification combined with a more assertive foreign policy. In the case of Morocco, we're seeing it in the African continent, but also the military spending. We've seen a period of an arms race between the two main Maghrebi countries, Algeria and Morocco. They were spending lots of money in purchasing weapons. I think combined, they basically were they bought more weapons than the rest of the African continent combined for several years. So how all that together could lead to either a change in the choreography, be it towards more regional integration, which now seems far away. But remember, back in the late 80s, when the Arab Maghreb Union was established, that was because of difficulties that these countries were facing simultaneously, especially socioeconomic problems, bread riots, falling revenues by states, or whether all those tensions, and we're seeing the rhetoric, recently between the two main Maghrebi countries, in part as a result of Trump's decision in December 2020, the rhetoric has been more aggressive towards each other, violent, if we can even call it that way, and whether that would lead to more, destabilization in the region, and what role for Gulf countries in all that. And I will finish by saying that also those economic constraints that Gulf countries are facing themselves as well, most likely will lead them to be less, to engage less in adventures, in foreign adventures, like the ones we saw over the past, especially 5-6 years, part of them as well taking place in North Africa, and to focus more, and I think this is something that Yusuf Sharif was referring to, that will focus more on their internal affairs and maybe less, contributing less to the polarization taking place already in some of the North African countries and their political systems. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Haitham. That was amazing. We got to summarize and afterwards ask more questions for us to reflect about the next days. And sincerely grateful for that. Now, bear with us, dear participants and dear public. The technicians need to make a certain adjustment before the closing remarks. We are having with us two honorary speakers, and it's really going to be a true honor to have Ambassador James Moran and Jeffrey Azugir with us. So bear with us a few minutes, if you might, and we'll be back to you soon with more. Hello back, dear listeners and dear participants in this seminar. It has been amazing up until now. And nowadays we are going to have the closing remarks. As Haitham mentioned, they are going to hinge on what role for Europe or for the European Union in the Mediterranean. Although I have the feeling we will touch upon some of the aspects that all of the panelists have brilliantly spoke about throughout the two sessions. We have with us our first honorary speaker, Ambassador James Moran. He's an Associate Senior Research Fellow with the Center for European Policy Studies. He was Principal Advisor on the Middle East and North Africa at the EU's External Action Service in Brussels in 2016-2017. From 2012 to 2016, he was Ambassador and Head of the European Union Delegation in the Arab Republic of Egypt, where I had the honor of working with him for a short period of time. And he also headed the EU missions to Jordan and Yemen in 2019, in 1999-2002. Ambassador Moran was also the EU senior coordinator in Libya during the 2011 uprising. His long service with the European institutions includes wide experience in European foreign, security, trade, and development policy in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Ambassador, thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Casa, Árabe, and the Fundación for putting together such an interesting group of people with a great deal to say. I won't even try to touch too much on what has been said already, but there's a great deal of food for thought. In fact, so much food, it reminds me a little bit of one of the favorite dishes of the Magreb, which I enjoy so much, which of course is couscous, and it's got that many ingredients. I just feel that we lack a chef to put it together in the way that a good Maghrebian chef would do it, and that we can enjoy the meal. It really is a situation which has become yet more complicated, yet more difficult as time has passed on. We've got all of the usual differences and splits over political Islam, the Brotherhood, Turkey's role in the region, which has of course been an irritant for many people for quite some time, not least in Europe as well. Now we have the Abraham Accords, so-called, the normalization agreements with Israel, which has led to more splits. Morocco, of course, signed one itself. Others have different views about this. And the list goes on. All of that accentuated by the continuing lack of economic integration, which one or two speakers have touched on in the course of the event today, and is an important backdrop to all of this, because without wishing to be too Eurocentric about the issue, as long as you don't have the economic glue to hold things together, you're bound to make things more difficult for yourself when it comes to things like security. And of course, you also have the continuing weakness of regional institutions. The poor old Arab League is as weak as it's ever been, and doesn't show too many signs of stepping up to the plate when it comes to any sort of regional security architecture going forward. This phrase, which has become current but has been around since 1948 in the region, we don't have that. So it's a little bit of a free-for-all, and with US retrenchment going on, Fred Wery pointed that out very well earlier on, the prospect has got to be a little bit difficult when it comes to putting all of this together. Now, so far as Europe is concerned, let me just concentrate on that for the time being, if I may. Europe has not punched its weight in the region for quite some time. Internal divisions within the EU over Libya, difficulties of the transatlantic relationship during the Trump years, now slowly coming back into focus again with the new Biden administration. The difficulties over migration, where you've had very much concerning relationships with the Maghreb, where you've had different member states going off in different directions. Brexit hasn't helped either to hold things together. And again, it's a long list. I don't want to go on too much about that, but without wishing to be naive or wearing too much of a rose-tinted glasses and all of this, there might be one or two opportunities ahead for Europe to be a little bit more effective when it comes to the long-sought goals of security, stability, development in the region. Why do I say that? Well, I think the first thing is on Libya. Now, speakers have pointed to that, but it is important that I think for the first time in quite a long time, we find that two of the main players within Europe who have been quite split on this for a long time, Italy and France, seem to be tracking back to finding this on the same page when it comes to support for the new government of national unity and the UN plan. Now, there's an awful long way to go, and there are still 20,000 mercenaries in the country. Anything could go wrong. Having spent time on the ground myself in Libya, I do not underestimate the difficulties that lie ahead for this government, nor indeed for the international community. But I think there is something happening there, and this involves the Gulf states too. We heard earlier about the visit of Mr. Dbeibeh to the UAE and indeed to Saudi Arabia. This is important. It seems there too that there might be something happening to give a little hope now for the first time in many, many years that the Libyan irritant might just be moving slowly, glacially perhaps, towards some sort of solution. And the EU is now able, I think, which was not the case before, to play a much more effective role than it did in the past. Certainly, the reason why you've had so much Gulf involvement, and indeed the Russians, let's not get that either, in the Libyan imbroglio, has been the absence of the West, writ large, of course, the United States, but also Europe. Europe's just not been there, except on humanitarian and some small developmental projects over the last few years. We really have not played much of a role there as Europe. And until and unless we do, I don't think that a Libyan solution is in the frame. But perhaps there is something happening. The second reason that I say there might be a prospect for a little bit more effective European foreign policy action has to do with the situation which is evolving in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, that involves primarily Libya and Egypt when it comes to the region, if you include Egypt as a brother of the Magreb, as it were. But it is important because it also has Turkey on the list as well. Turkey relations, very important. It is just conceivable there that the EU might be able to push forward. And I see that in the EU policy paper on the Southern Neighborhood, which was issued a couple of months ago, there is a call for a conference on the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, conferences of themselves don't solve anything, but it's the first time that you've seen the EU take an initiative on this incredibly difficult, complicated, and dangerous situation evolving in the Eastern Mediterranean, which involves the Maghreb, involves the Gulf, and involves European interests themselves. So I think the other point that the policy paper makes, there are many things to talk about in that, is this issue of nearshoring. And here we come on to the economy. Be very interested to see what the professor has to say about this too. Europe has become, many people feel, a bit too dependent on East Asia for its value change. Now, you know, of course, there is this move to try to do more when it comes to involving North Africa and the Middle East, particularly North Africa, in European value chains. And I think there is some prospect there. There may even be prospect for some collaboration with the Gulf. For a long, long time, when I was in Egypt, I remember these conversations going on. We were talking about joint developmental financing with the Gulf institutions. It never really came to much. The banks, the development banks, the European Investment Bank, on the one hand, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Kuwaiti funds and so on, had very different ways of operating. It's very hard, given the very different administrative cultures and indeed governance of these institutions, to bring them together. But it was always thought that there could be some interesting possibilities there for spurring investment in North Africa, which of course is desperately needed. But, and here is my last point, whatever the EU does or does not do in terms of contributing to stability in the region in the next year or so, it's very important to remember that there is one issue which is not in the region, which is paramount for EU policy makers. Excuse me 1 second, I have to close the door. I have a rather playful cat here who is not leaving me alone. But this issue, of course, is Iran. It is often cited as Europe's greatest foreign policy achievement, that it contributed, along with others, of course, to the JCPOA. Now there's a chance of bringing it back into being. Like the US, we heard this from Fred earlier, like the US, this is an exclusive priority for European foreign policy. And I think that that means that Europe will need very much to keep the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, of course, on side, working together with the US and others in taking forward the debate on Iran. And this also means that in terms of being too confrontational over some of the issues like spoilers in Libya, UAE financing of mercenaries, or indeed the Gulf role in supporting Morocco's claimed sovereignty over Western Sahara, which is difficult for a number of European member states, given the UN Charter. This is not something which I think Europe is going to take to the limit. Whatever it takes, using now Prime Minister Mario Draghi's famous phrase, whatever it takes to get that Iran deal back online is going to be the number one and exclusive priority in the near term for European foreign policy. So one should not forget it and not have any illusions about Europe becoming too active in terms of contributing to overall security in the Magreb. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for all of your participants and speakers. I learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador James Moran, speaking from Brussels, from the heart of Europe, also undergoing very, very tough restrictions due to COVID-19. Of course, this last section is dedicated to that role that the EU can or wants to play in the region, in balancing probably these two poles, the Gulf and the Maghreb, that we have been discussing for the past 2 hours and a half. The issue of Iran is indeed key, as you mentioned. We have barely touched upon the Abraham Accords for some reason. And it is true that there may be some spoilers for this JCPOA reactivation. And we literally on the news were hearing of this attack on the nuclear facilities in Natanz, and that the Mossad might be allegedly involved in it, or at least they haven't denied their participation. So there might be other spoilers for the Iran-EU rapprochement, and definitely a challenge for European diplomats. Let's move on to our last but not least speaker, and maybe in that sense, he is the chef that Ambassador Moran was pointing towards as the chef who will finally make this couscous be able to be enjoyable for all of us. Yahya Zubair is professor of international relations and international management and director of research in geopolitics at Kedge Business School. He has been international visiting faculty in numerous universities and business schools for the last 30 years in China, the United States, various European and Asian countries. He has published dozens of scholarly works, including books, articles, entries in encyclopedias and book chapters on international politics, foreign policy, governance, and security issues. He has served as consultant for governments and companies worldwide. In 2020, he was visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center in Qatar. Thank you very much, Yahya, for joining us from Marseille. And you have also your 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you, Casa Árabe, for hosting me. I find it a little bit difficult to talk after so many panelists, but I think I have a few things to contribute. One of the, about many years ago, I had written a piece on the impact of the Gulf War on the Maghreb. And I tried to analyze at that time the reactions of the people of the Maghreb vis-a-vis the Gulf countries. What transpired from that study is that the Maghrebis, at that time I did only the three, the central Maghreb, that is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia. And what appeared was the attitudes of the populations in the region towards the Gulf. It was mostly negative in the sense that though they had condemned the invasion of Kuwait, but at the same time, they were not very pleased with the Gulf Arabs. This was in the 1990s, the early 1990s. And my question today would be, since we have been talking only about the states, we haven't talked about the people. What is it that the people of the Maghreb think about the Gulf? What are the issues that are most important to the people of the Maghreb, as far as the region, the Gulf region is concerned. The Maghrebis are, mostly concerned about the Palestinian issue. That is probably in the top of their priorities. We have seen it's true. Many of the speakers have talked about the money that the Gulf Arabs have brought, mostly to Morocco, not to Tunisia. And if I look from a geopolitical perspective, not much has changed since the 1970s. The Gulf Arabs supported Morocco in the occupation of Western Sahara. That is nothing new. The Saudis were pumping money during that time with the blessing of France. And today is probably, is obviously the same scenario taking place. And this is creating a very big problem. I would talk about the Abraham Accords, since you said there wasn't enough. I think you are right, because we have not calculated the implications of what has happened, especially for Algeria, which now feels encircled like it did in the 1970s, which means that it will antagonize, this situation. Will poison relations between France and Algeria, which is happening, by the way, including the announcement by the La République en Marche, opening an office in Dakhla, against international law and what have you. So this is a very bad issue. Again, what will happen, my scenario, if the Algerians feel pushed too hard, you will see more of a presence of Russia and China in the region. In other words, a recomposition of alliances. Algeria tends to be non-aligned, avoiding any any preference for it takes weapons from Russia, its traditional supplier, it's doing infrastructure with the Chinese, good relations, even anti-terrorism with the United States. But the Abraham Accords may undo or transform the attitudes in the region. And there are a few things that I would like to mention that the GCC, I'm not talking about who is right or who's wrong within the GCC in terms of the conflict, but the conflict spilled over into Libya. We have seen it in terms of, the UAE siding with the East, Qatar siding with the, Qatar siding with the West, and the UAE with the East, with the support of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. And that is also a problem from, we have not talked about it, from a regional perspective. Algerians are very annoyed by that presence, even of Turkey, by the way. And so are the Tunisians in many ways, because it adds to the problems already existing in the area. When I raise the issue of the people and how they feel, you have to look at the pictures of when the marches took place in Algeria in 2019. And they had, billboards with UAE stay out and so on and so forth. That is, that the Gulf were not, are perceived as troublemakers in the region. And there's an overlap, if you wish, with the governments or with the states, particularly Algeria and Tunisia. And so that's as far as the Iraq is concerned, which was, in my view, sort of taking the temperature of the views of the people towards the Gulf, including, with the Moroccans with this Abraham Accords. We don't know yet what the Moroccan people themselves, who are pro-Palestinian, what they feel, or how can they express their real feelings about that accord, that happened after December 10th. So that is a big issue, and I think it's gonna bring more problems. one thing that has not been mentioned, if I may just throw it at the audience, is the Sahel. In terms of security, the Sahel is connected to the Maghreb, and the Saudis and the Emiratis have pledged and have done, given money to the G5. And so, and the perception from the region, depending on where with whom you side, obviously, but it bodes well. I mean, it doesn't bode well for the reason as such, because now they see all these interferences within the region as bringing more problems, creating problems between Europe and so on. And by the way, this notion that somehow the Gulf, the GCC is bringing a lot of wealth in the region. Again, I think, and I hope that Ambassador Moran would agree with me, Europe is still the main player. You have to look at the trade statistics to know that whoever is in the region does not, match, the trade relations and the traditional ties. What the Maghrebi states are doing, all of them, whatever their nature, are trying to get some sort of autonomy, because none of them has succeeded in breaking the dependency in which they have been tied in the post-colonial era. So it gave them some freedom. If you look even to Morocco, it was in 2016 that the King Mohammed VI, made a famous speech where he said, we have to diversify, and turned a little bit to China. But trade with China, which is favorable to China, by the way, amounts to $4.6 billion only. It's not, it's not groundbreaking. Whereas the EU with Morocco, total volume would probably is around $50 billion. So there is no commensurate measure. What I'm trying to say is very simple, is that the presence or the involvement of the Gulf countries has not been all that positive. I mentioned Libya, okay? In Algeria, you have the problem, and I think Tunisia, I don't know if Youssef talked about it, the Medkhalist. That was also one of the brand of Islam that was brought to the region. The Maghreb is Maliki right. It is not Wahhabi right. It is not. It is a problem in the region, and so it creates tensions socially. So it's a real problem. And this problem with the Western Sahara, if the Europeans and the United States does not come together to try to find a solution, a serious solution, rather than allowing the conflict to drag on like it has for the last 30 years, I think it's a big problem. I was attending a seminar earlier today at Tiremam here in Paris, in Aix-en-Provence, and the arguments are the same. And these are scholars, obviously, and they blame France. And France is in cahoots with the Emiratis, and this is a real problem for the region. I think that Europe, since I take advantage of the presence of Ambassador Moran, to say, the Europeans have to wake up and smell the coffee, because that problem is not going to disappear overnight. You're not going to say, okay, you have the Abraham Accords. I recognize your sovereignty over a territory that you have occupied that is still at the United Nations, at the United Nations Security Council and so on, or the Court of Justice of the European Union. Has recognized the sovereignty of Morocco over the territory. So it's a problem. It's a time bomb, and of course it's going to result in more arms race. And of course, somebody had mentioned here who is supplying or who is spending most of the money, more than Africa together, and this circulation of weapons, will end up being used. So I think that the level-headed people have to look into the area. And now, since you have talked about COVID-19 and so on, the problems are boiling. There are people are faced with Ramadan tomorrow. You're going to see that the purchasing power of the populations has gone down. You know, the economic, socioeconomic situations are not so good. So if you add a geopolitical problem and a conflict, I mean, it may get into an armed conflict again. And if it breaks out, I think it would not bode well for the region. These are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Bravo.
That has been amazing, Professor Subir. Thanks also Ambassador Moran. It has been an honor. Thanks so much to all the panelists. I could stay here for hours and even days, but I don't think that's the case for everybody. So thanks so much for the insights. I think for the food for thought and maybe for the material for new events, as you said, it is so important to speak about the public opinion and about the societies themselves. So maybe that should be a motivation for us to focus away from geopolitics and on the peoples, which are the ones who we should be caring about. Thanks for reminding us of that. And I'm going to leave Karim to close, to wind up the event. Thanks so much to all the participants, the ones who've left, the ones who are still with us, and please take care, and Ramadan Kareem, of course, as it's starting tomorrow. And again, it has been a huge honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Ichaso, and thank you to both Yahya Zubair and Ambassador James Moran for those concluding remarks. I think they were extremely insightful. Indeed, what the people want was, in the end, what actually sparkled, were the sparkle behind those Arab uprisings, and those were turning points not only for the people of the region, but for the reactions of the states that we have been talking about for the past 3 hours almost. So it is very important to keep that in mind. As Ichaso was suggesting, maybe we should design another seminar a bit more focused also on that dimension that I think is hugely important. Feeling cornered is never a good thing, and a state such as Algeria, as Yahya was pointing out, is we have actually been doing some conferences here at Casa Árabe, somehow to keep an eye on Algeria and also on the Sahel, which is a region that is extremely important for Europe, but also for the Magreb, for the north of Africa. Those let's say those issues of borders that are very porous and that bring about extremely volatile situations for many of the states that we have been talking about, Tunisia being one of them, of course Algeria, and indeed the issue of the Western Sahara that we are always touching upon slightly, and that is very often difficult to pin down, especially from Spain. Of course, a word to thank everyone that has taken part in this marathon, in this event, in this webinar. To those of us, all of you who have been listening across, the event will be still available online if you want to check on it at different times after this is over. And maybe a comment on the title that we chose for this seminar, the Gulf and the Maghreb in Uncertain Times. I think these times are, in a way, to paraphrase Zygmunt Bauman and his concept of liquid modernity, that constant change, that fragility, that vulnerability that permeates or affects all of our infrastructures these days and our social contracts. We are witnessing changes, major changes that are happening at such a rapid pace that the individuals and societies and their behaviors cannot react fast enough to what these changes are in the end bringing about. You know, it's very challenging, and so also to paraphrase one of those journals, newspapers that are printed in a slightly pink color, we live in uncertain times. Thank you very much for everyone, and make sure you follow each other's works, and we are more than pleased to host you, both Fundación Alternativas and Casa Árabe. We will be watching very closely the events that are unfolding soon, elections, the end of the year in Libya, precisely that we've been talking so much about Libya and the Dbeiba government. We expect to see also some changes there. Algeria, of course, also before that, and the future of the Iraq movement. So thank you everyone again, and we were very pleased to have you all on board on this occasion. Till the next time, and Ramadan Kareem, and a la prochaine. Hasta luego.